Welcome to everyone who's joined us today. We have many people who have joined us from both the UK and from South Africa. Thank you very much for being present. I'm Sharon Constanson. I'm CEO of Valuefin and Constanson Currencies, a treasury outsourcing service providers and advisors to companies who have importing and exporting risk in the currency market. We're going to be running a series, we're calling it Forex Risk Management Uncovered. The idea of this series is to address in short sound bites the key things that we see customers not understanding, not addressing correctly, or could do better, or need really to have a look at improvements that they can consider. The idea is not to create risk, but also to save money for the organization at the same time. This series will probably run over a period of about 3 months, and we will be doing each one in small sound bites so that they're easily absorbable by everyone. I'd like to introduce my guest who is with me today. That is Eddie Rawl. Eddie and I have known each other for a fair amount of time, having been in the same industry for decades. So it's an industry we both know extremely well, and we have seen just about everything the market can show us of the things that go right and things that don't necessarily work as well as they should. So what is foreign exchange risk management is important to understand so that we actually are not talking about something different when we're talking to different people on the same topic. What are the most typical actions that cause risks and often cause costs? And this is through the experience Eddie and I have in the marketplace of working with companies as to the things they've done wrong. Eddie also has the experience as I do. We've both been on the bank side, and we see the kind of mistakes that and risks that impact companies when they're operating directly with a service currency provider. What areas of foreign exchange do we tend to find misunderstandings in? So one of the most common areas where companies are either creating risk or creating cost. The role and the value of a foreign exchange risk management function, and why a company should have some form of dedicated focus on their foreign exchange risk. And then over the period of the 12 weeks, we will be addressing real life case studies of examples that we have seen in the business world and that you can learn from. Those will be both good and improved areas that we will cover. So Eddie, I think the first thing I'd like us to share, talk about, discuss is helping an organization to understand what their exposure is. So maybe you can share with us to start with why that sounds so simple, but why we know from bitter experience how difficult that is to achieve.
Yes, Sharon, thank you very much. Yeah, it does sound unbelievably simple, but it actually is not. I've seen companies in the past that only recognize exposures a couple of months after they've placed an order. And when you ask them, but don't you have an exposure when you place the order? They say, no, I only have an exposure once the goods are shipped. And that's simply not true. But the thing is, if you don't know, and if you don't recognize your exposure at the right time, you're not going to cost your goods at the right price. It's as simple as that.
If you look at it from an exposure and an order point of view, if you've got an order from a customer and you've placed an order on a supplier, you have a commitment. So you do have an exposure. So I absolutely agree with you. Some organizations might say they can cancel it and therefore it isn't an exposure. But the chances are, if they're in the business of constantly cancelling orders, I'd question their business model from the start point if that behavior is prevalent. Things that are important that we need to understand if we're working with a big diamond company, we're working with a manufacturing plant, we're working with a services industry, we're looking after a tech company, for example, it would be very critical from our understanding of the way we look at this to understand that what the company's risk appetite is, particularly the person's risk appetite. So if an organization has their own treasury, how would they determine their risk appetite?
Yeah, I think obviously the risk appetite is something that has to be approved by the board of directors. It's not something that the treasurer can sit and just suck out of his thumb. It's got to be a scientific study, and a case study or combining all the factors that cause the risk and valuation of those risks. And only then can the board sit and make informed decisions as to what their risk appetite is.
Absolutely. And if you can imagine the risk appetite, if the Treasury stroke board approved has a risk appetite that is not aligned to the business appetite for risk, competitiveness, behavior, customer achievement, if those two aren't aligned at the same point in time, you are going to be creating a huge degree of risk in addition. So I think that's an area where people and boards they think that they've provided something that in English seems very simple, but in reality actually is not risk protection in any respect. So you talked a moment ago about the process of research and understanding what the risks are. Please share with me how, in your experience, you've aligned that into a policy document potentially for an organization.
I think, I've seen transactions where companies don't actually see all the risks. For instance, a company imports stuff out of the US and Europe, and they pay in dollars and euro, and they export everything into Africa to their own subsidiaries in Africa in rand. So I said to the guy, why do you want to do that? I don't want the risk. I said, but you've got risk. So they did not understand that they're now actually buying currency to pay the suppliers overseas, and they're selling currency that they receive. They have to then get rand from their local guys instead of using the offset. Yeah. There's timing differences, but the timing differences they could have sorted out by just doing a swap.
Yep,
the other thing is that in Africa, the rand is trading at a 30-40 cent spread, whereas here it's trading at a 3-4 cent spread. Exactly. So by just asking that, and most of those countries are either, their currencies are aligned either to the dollar or pegged to the dollar or the euro, which trades at a much tighter spread than the rand. So take dollars or euro from them and pay your supplier.
Exactly. So just that's a simple area of understanding how we identify what risk is there. What for me is quite key is I was talking to a client this morning and we were discussing the policy document that they have that is restricted to the point that it's impossible to operate and to run a season of their imports or exports. The policy is so restrictive. So we don't want a policy that actually in itself creates risk. We want something that is a guidance to the treasurer, finance director, financial manager, whoever it is in the company, to be able to operate within it safely, well, to protect their job and themselves, but doing the right thing for the organization at the same time. And you, as I have, probably seen so many policy documents that are honestly not fit for purpose. I've written many again and again and again. If we look at the creation of risk, you gave us an example a moment ago of a risk where somebody has made a strategic decision on how to import or export from a currency pricing point of view. Maybe we could just talk a bit now about the processes that some companies implement that in themselves actually create risks. So they say, I'm going to do X, Y, Y, or whatever. Maybe you've got some good examples.
Yeah, I think, some companies are saying, or actually, the majority of companies that I've seen are saying, now I only recognize the risk or the exposure when I get the invoice or the bill of lading or whatever. Now, I mean, they've created risk. If that order was placed 30 days, before they get the invoice, they've run the risk for 30 days without even recognizing it. Yeah. Some of my clients now are saying that his orders, because of COVID and the short supply chain issues around the world, his goods have now been moved delivery has been moved 6 months out. So that means he's going to take an extra 6 months worth of risk if he used that before he recognizes the exposure.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very, very key one. Another one, a really, really simple one to share. And this is a circumstance that I've seen a number of times, particularly in a sort of a group structure where you have operating companies and a head office treasury type function. Is the process is that every Friday they have to advise the head office of the accurate information around their exposures. And the head office will promptly take that information and go and take out the required forward cover so that they are now 100% forward covered on information received, which is an anathema in itself, but that's a different story. We've covered one of those and we'll go into that in more detail. But there they're sitting with a provider who gives them currency, who knows at 3 o'clock that company is going to phone them and do X amount of trade on which they are front running, be prepared for, ready to margin, whatever it is. You become predictable in the market. And that's just one process. The other fact is within that week, you've got 7 days of risk that you've not addressed. And why? Just because you do it on Friday at 3 o'clock, it works. But that's not protection at all. The decision points. Yeah, as a Forex treasurers, you and I know, we're having to make decisions all day, every day, consistently for our customers. How would you recommend to a finance director a proactive, active, logical way to determine their decision points within their company so that they are interacting effectively with the market?
I think that's a very difficult one. If I had to tell you how many times I've heard, now on a Friday afternoon, the rand strengthens. And in more than 40 years of Forex trading, I've not actually been able to determine that one. So, yeah, the interaction, it's not something that you could leave for, for a specific time of the day. You need to watch the markets. You need to see what the trends are doing, where you are in the trend. And based on all of those factors, you decide when you enter the market and when not to.
And I'm sure there's a story you've heard many, many times before. I drove in the morning listening to the news and thought, oh my goodness, I better do something when I get to my desk. I really look after covering the rand, for example, or the sterling's just moved and fallen below the 130 mark, or whatever the occasion is. And on the way home, they hear the news thinking, I didn't get time to do it. How many times have we heard that one? And the tears that follow are quite often.
Yeah.
Another thing that I saw recently, onboarding a new customer, and we were chatting to the customer about the nature and the structure of their portfolio and the type of forward cover instruments that they are using. And they are the sort of derivative style instruments that do behave differently. And it was quite a lesson to the customer to understand the appropriateness of some of these alternative instruments that they could be using or are using. What have you found in that space?
To be honest, I know forward contract is also classified as a derivative, but I don't see it as really as a derivative.
The vanilla.
We're talking derivatives. Yeah, we're talking options in that.
Yes.
And in my experience, an option it has its place in this world, but 99% of the times, and I hope there's no banks listening to us now, but then they should disappear in shame. It's a way to hide margin. It's as simple as that. And the clients do not really understand the products that they're being offered. It looks great. And when you start pointing out the risk, for instance, where you have a double up sort of thing, and you say to the guy, so what happens? Yeah, and they said, no, it's so far away, and I'll be happy to sell at that level. I said, okay, but you must remember one thing, that option will only be exercised if the market is trading much higher. Otherwise, you won't be exercised. Oh yeah, didn't think about that.
And on a given day. And a whole bunch of conditions and the things that can go wrong during the life of it. You and I probably feel, the audience probably think we've choreographed this conversation, to which we haven't under any circumstances. But there's the only area and time one could consider something in the option space where I have, under duress, looked at it and said, because of the nature of the customer's portfolio, because of the uniqueness of a tender, for example, that they have to put in, and they have to hold the risk aspect for the duration of the tender, there can be instruments that can be cost effectively used for that purpose. But in most cases, companies are tendering for business that is aligned to their volumes and turnover, and therefore you can work it within the portfolio and not have to use something that isn't in itself creating a risk. So very interesting point. You also get some of the forward contracts that have different behaviors within the forward contract market. You'll have partly and fully optional contracts, which in themselves have a degree of cost and risk to an organization where they're throwing money away and adding cost on top. So that is something that is a deep misunderstanding that we see quite often. There's a comment that I think is something you and I discussed a little while back, where we said that quite a senior organization we'd been discussing, and their comment was that I get my advice from the bank. Comment, please.
Look, yeah, I've heard that a lot as well, and I'm still hearing it. You know, customers are typically speaking to customer dealers within the banks. The customer dealers in the banks, if they look at how they progress through their dealing careers, they would find that customer dealers are actually quite low on the rung of dealers. If you want some advice, speak to an interbank dealer, and even there, I would advise you not to speak to an interbank dealer, because he's going to tell you what he wants you to do. He's going to talk his book. The customer dealers are simply not qualified to give a client advice for one reason only. If you only want to use one reason, it's because they know nothing about the client's business, or very little about the client's business.
Exactly. And the problem, to add it to that, which does astound me, is the degree to which the customer doesn't understand their business. So what hope has the customer dealer got of giving any form of valid advice that isn't just generic to what the market is currently doing and the in-house view at that moment? How often have you seen that within the aspect of reporting exposures, recording information, sending reports up to board, what's the quality you tend to see in that space?
To be honest, I think it's terrible, and the problem is that, as you've said, that customers don't always understand their exposures correctly, and the board, 99% of the times, know even less. So they're not equipped, I think, to ask the right questions. But yeah, if like the example you mentioned, they only collect the information every Friday. Say, how good is your information? It's no good, to be honest. And if you don't understand all your risks, it's also no good. So I think the reporting to the board is totally inadequate in most cases. Even in companies that have their own treasuries.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. That's actually quite an interesting point. And the other thing that goes with that is, where do you find the reporting system? And one of the outcomes you and I will have seen over and over and over again is the Excel spreadsheet, which is inert and inaccurate and prone to error, as being the control environment for the organization. I'm just going to run through these quickly, because this is meant to be a nice short session. It's not going to be, so at this rate we'll be doing 3 sessions just in one. Some of the myths that you and I have seen in the marketplace. And the comment in that first one is, we have a robust Forex policy approved by the board. I think that's probably something we covered a moment ago in our earlier discussion. The other comment I'd like you to maybe feedback on is the second one. We're in the business of widgets, manufacturing seals or something like that. We're not in the foreign exchange business, so we take no risk. I'm sure that echoes in your brain.
Seen that and heard that a lot. The fact of the matter is, if you're importing or exporting, you are in the Forex business, whether you like it or not, because you can either buy whatever your policy, if your policy has, like, let's say 100% cover or no cover, you can either price yourself out of the market and everybody goes to your competition, or you're taking big losses and you're also out of the market. So, yeah, I think, a lot of policies, I think, because the reason they're so inadequate is because a lot of it's copy and paste, and it's not designed around the actual business.
Yeah. And also it's done by people who use words that they think is a control environment. So internal audit or compliance or governance are coming up with these ideas, imparting it upon somebody who's in finance who can't really validate whether that's true or not, because neither of them are in treasury. And if you look at it, where do you get your education in treasury, in Forex treasury? We got it on the street. That's where we learned it. We did it. We worked in banks. We worked in companies. We've worked as advisors. We've seen hundreds of these kind of situations over and over again. And we know, even if a company says, okay, I export, I import, I do everything in rand, or I do everything in sterling, whichever their home currency might be, everything in euros. We have customers that work on all those bases. Just by staying in your home currency, to your point that you made a moment ago, the impact there is that they will put in a buffer into the accounting costing price. And by putting in that buffer, the outcome, as you just described it, is costing themselves straight out the market. So even when they don't touch Forex, they actually do in their pricing. So I agree with you 100% on that.
I've seen a very, well, we've had a couple in my days in the big corporates where, let's say you're importing out of Japan, and if you go and analyze your competition, that comes out of Germany. So what is your currency risk is not only the yen, you have to watch what the Germans, in those days, the Deutschmark is doing.
Yes, I remember those days.
Because if you're not paying cognizance of what that currency is doing, you could lose your market share. Simple.
Very easily. So, and I think that is an area that you've just raised that honestly, I don't think companies even consider. No, I just think that one just completely bypasses them in so many ways. And now with less currencies than we used to have, it probably is easier to manage than it used to be when we had 12 European currencies to manage at that point in time. We've talked about the protecting the company that we don't speculate. So I'm going to leave it just, other than the last comment that is on that list. We cover imports, but we don't cover exports or vice versa. You smile.
Well, I mean, that is taking an absolute view. It's exactly this, like saying I cover all my, and that's in fact what that is. I cover my imports 100% and I don't cover my exports. So you're taking an absolute view that this currency is going to depreciate forever and a day. And it doesn't. We've seen, I can show you graphs where 40 it goes years, up and down. Yeah.
So, and it might be a trend, but within weeks, within months, within years, we see massive variations, 5, 6, 7% both ways. But in my view, almost, if we cover the one and not the other, we're doubling our risk, if not rather than halving our risk in the first place.
Yeah.
Based on the other comments there, I think most of those we actually have covered in our earlier conversation. So I'm just going to jump to the next slide. And we were looking at the underlying changes that occur within the business. Now, going back to that point that I'm 100% covered at a certain point in time. Most businesses, hopefully, are going concerns, and they have got ongoing new business coming through. Orders do get cancelled, customers don't deliver, they end up with stock that they're going to have to do something different with. The underlying orders are changing before they're invoiced, all that kind of thing. How does that noise, or how should a finance director try and get their mind process systems around this morphing environment that they're living in?
I think and again, I'm talking way back when I was in a big corporate. The approach was, this is a going concern. We're going to be in business not only for the next 6 months, we're going to be in business for the next year and 10 years. So we can't just look at currency risk for the stuff that we've actually ordered or actually imported. We need to look way beyond that, because we need to plan and strategically decide what are we going to do. And in those days, it wasn't as easy as it is today. In those days, we had to go to the Reserve Bank and ask special approval to look at currency risk beyond the normal 3-month import window.
Mm-hmm. And the other aspect that you see with companies is the, okay, we're a going concern. Last year we imported 2 billion. So we're going to do the same this year. But I actually have no idea if that's true or not. So I go and take out some form of hedging based on literally a thumbs up. And I've seen that many times. And from a business management point of view, if I were the board, I would be extremely upset with my organization if that's their attitude towards creating risk. The other thing that we talked about a little bit earlier was, when do we enter the market? Why do we enter it? What are the decision-making processes? But I think we covered that in one of the future sessions in more detail. To all the participants listening, I must apologize for the noise near me. The person, you won't believe it, is miles away on the other side of the room. It is making a huge amount of noise. I do apologize. The other thing that we have that we need to consider is when the activity needs to happen, not on a Friday, but during the week, we now need to pay an invoice. We need to receive funds from our CFC account, for example. How would you advise companies to approach that moment in time?
Well, I think we're talking about a receipt now, for instance, on exports, okay? So when the money comes in, you need to look at what is your level of cover at that point in time? Where's the market trading? What do you want to increase or decrease your cover levels, or do you want your cover levels to remain unchanged? And based on that, you're going to decide whether you're going to convert using an FEC, whether you're going to convert at spot, or whether you're going to leave it in your CFC account. It's not just, okay, I've taken cover for it, now the money has come in, and now I must use the cover. Because
how many people try and marry this one piece of paper with this one invoice?
Yeah, and that's not, to me, that's not a going concern type thing. It just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work at all. And the other thing that happens, we talked about the top left-hand side of the slide, where we talk about the fact the business is constantly generating change. In that process, you will end up with some cover that is not required. I was talking to a company the other day. I said, well, we don't want it, so we cancelled it. I said, so when did you place the next order? No, the same day.
Yeah.
And you say you're not in the business of foreign exchange risk management. You've just gone and cancelled some good cover. And we convinced a customer the other day just to hold that cover. You don't need it. The order has changed. Hold that cover. It's at a rational rate given the trend of the market over a period of time. Yeah. He thinks I'm God at the moment, which is wonderful, because it was the right decision to have taken. And he understands now that you don't have to try and marry these pieces of paper together all the time, that you can look at a portfolio of hedging and a portfolio of requirement, and making sure that you are staying within any form of regulation in the process, and your policy and your appetite and. The last 3 points there, I'm not going to go through in detail now, because Eddie, you and I will have great fun on these ones in more detail in future sessions. But the whole issue around swap cash flow management, either on extensions or drawdowns, how we determine what the actual cost to company or benefit to company was of a invoice being paid or an invoice being received. In other words, what really is the money that belongs in the accounting system. One of the things that we would also go through is how the accounting system and the reality of Forex business virtually never say the same thing. So how do you know what the business profitability is and what the accounting profitability is? Because accountants have definitely created a nightmare for all of us when it comes to their ways of having to set spot rates within systems and actually force variation to constantly cloud the picture. We'll talk in future sessions more about the role of the Treasury function. This is either the finance director, it is the financial manager, it is a treasurer if they're lucky with some experience in the space. But how often we see this to be a debtors or creditors clerk within the organization, or a more junior financial person that is given the process to manage the foreign exchange rather than being proactive, having timely information, having the ability to make an instant decision based on market information and their own information, and being able to recognize. I think the thing that maybe I just want us to talk about just for a moment is, how would you advise a finance director who is not a treasury specialist to be mindful of flaws, inaccuracies, and misunderstandings within their systems? How would you get them to become a little smarter at picking up the problems on a regular basis?
That's a very difficult one. I really don't know. You know, without having been in the market and without actually seeing all the stuff that we've seen over the years, it is extremely difficult for an accountant to look. Their training is substantial and very wide, but they come out of there and they think they know everything about everything, and the fact is they don't, because treasury is a specialized field. And I have friends that are CFOs of listed companies, and they do not understand FX and the risks associated with it, and the compiling and the reporting. They don't understand the stuff like we do. It's just as simple as that. The only way you can get better at it is employ somebody that knows what he's doing, because he's not going to get better by himself.
No, unfortunately, you're absolutely right on that. The only advice I would give to a finance director is get somebody in who does know what they're doing, just to do an audit every now and then, just to oversee things for you quickly and say, here are key things that you can fix the next quarter. These are things you can fix to start at least a journey of improvement, a journey of continuous learning, and to help them to get things to be done better. Because sometimes it's a big leap of faith to bring in somebody expensive, or to change systems and processes completely, and an even bigger leap of faith to bring in somebody from an external consultancy perspective to help, which obviously from a cost effectiveness point of view is probably the quickest, simplest solution, but not necessarily one that their appetite is ready for at a certain point in time. In the sessions coming up ahead of us, we're going to consider a number of case studies, ones that we've alluded to now today at a high level, but we'll write up these case studies as learning experiences so that we will create a library and a solution bank for organizations to be able to pick on certain topics and say, this is what I just said. Do these guys talk about that somewhere in their portfolio of solutions? And just support the market to becoming more self-aware of the risks and self-aware of the costs they are creating by doing things in a process-orientated fashion rather than with deep knowledge of the foreign exchange market. You were talking a moment ago about accountants. And if you look at local money market treasury, that is far easier for accountants to understand, is their local currency treasury, because interest rate management is something that is covered in huge amounts of detail in their training. But foreign exchange, costing of product, those kind of areas of financial risk management are just not covered by a CA or a CCMA or all the various different accounting degrees. And I did appreciate your comment you made earlier, and I think this is where our library is going to be very useful, is to boards. Because boards as a collective really struggle with a lot of concepts foreign exchange being absolutely one of them. And I was working with the board once, and they had created these beautiful slides. I mean, everything looked so fancy. It did not say anything. It did not add any value to what the risk was of their organization. So I've seen and done that one. What I would like to do is I'll see if there's any questions that have come up under the Q&A. I know I didn't mention at the beginning, but yes, we have got one question that I'd like us to address. And that is, let me just read it quickly here. The opportunity that this individual is probably a financial director or financial manager, but I sense a senior financial person within the organization with the remit of Forex. And they're saying, where should I turn? I hear you, but what are my choices to try and upskill myself or my team in my organization? I'd like to take that one.
Yeah, you know, a very good friend of mine who was the CFO at the time of a listed company said to me one day, I want to start my own treasury. I said to him, do you know what that entails? It entails massively expensive systems, because just a treasury on its own, you need systems to record and value and report. If you don't have that, you're dead. So now you have a massively expensive system. You need somebody that can manage all that information that comes in. That person can't work on his or her own. You need backup.
Where's your depth and backup? Yes, your resilience.
You need segregation of duties.
Yes, you do. You're right.
I said to him, the best advice I can give you is let me do it for you. But he then took my report to one of the big auditing firms, who charged him a fortune in consulting fees. But ultimately, the skills and the experience that we have is dying out.
As practitioners in the market.
Yeah, it's dying out.
The real practitioners.
You're seeing fewer and fewer people that have the skills and the experience.
Yeah, that is actually really quite interesting. One of the
there's only one way to get it.
Sorry, my apologies, carry on.
No, there's only one way to get it, and that's hire an outsourcing company.
Who have the alignment of risk appetite, reporting, culture, deliverables to what you are looking for as an organization. And there are many out there that do varying degrees of services. And the important one is actually to find what works for that company. What is it that they need? And no, there's no perfect match. There's not one solution. It's making sure that you find the one that is aligned to the organization and their needs with the degree of knowledge. I know some organizations will just get somebody to just go buy me this is what I want, go buy it. Another person says, this is what I think I need. And my question is, why do you think so? Let's determine if you do. And now that you do, what are our choices? Very different kind of conversation, as just one example. Eddie, you've been a pleasure to spend some time with. I really, really enjoy brainstorming around the foreign exchange market. It's something I am extremely passionate about, having done it for a corporate, having done it for a bank, and then having done it for hundreds of corporates. As a consultant and working with them, giving anything from advice to being the Treasury Department and providing the systems. And Eddie and I work very close together, know each other extremely well, but we do operate in different organizations. Eddie's side is currently at Best Forex, where he works with individuals and smaller corporates. So we will make sure that you are able to get hold of either of us if you wish to do so. So we will put that information up on the website. Thanks very much for everyone who's attended today. And please, by all means, email either of us with information requests. Thank you.
Thank you.